Number 1. The UL-BRHT swords. In 1995, a metallurgist examining a Viking sword in a conservation lab noticed something that made him put down his tools. Alan Williams at the Wallace Collection in London began an investigation that would fundamentally dismantle everything historians thought they knew about when human beings first achieved industrial-level production capability. What the analysis revealed inside that sword was crucible steel, the kind that requires temperatures above 1600 degrees Celsius sustained across the entire melt, distributed evenly through the blade, pure and homogeneous in a way that medieval European technology had no means of producing. The sword was dated to approximately 800 AD, making it roughly 1200 years old. This meant the blade predated the Industrial Revolution by 1,000 years. It predated the furnace technology required to produce it. It predated every documented method that could have created it. It predated the trade routes historians had proposed as a possible source. And most disturbingly of all, it was not alone. Blades stamped with the name Ulfbert appear across Scandinavia from 800 to 1000 AD, and every single one contains the same impossible steel. For over a century, the accepted story of Viking metallurgy went like this. Norse smiths were skilled craftsmen working within the limits of what their technology allowed. They produced pattern-welded iron, tough and functional, and when Islamic trade routes opened up access to better material, they imported what they could. The quality of a Viking blade reflected what 9th century Northern Europe could produce or acquire. That was the story, written into textbooks, confirmed by a century of excavation. The foundational account of what medieval European hands were capable of making. Ulfbert shatters that account completely. Williams examined 44 Ulfbert blades and published his findings in 2012. The steel is not Wootz imported through Islamic trade routes. Wootz produces a distinctive carbide banding pattern when worked into a blade, and the Ulfbert blades do not show it. The carbon distribution is chemically distinct from Wootz, distinct from any steel produced anywhere on Earth in that period, and it is not imported material worked locally. It is a fundamentally different material produced by a process that has never been identified. Williams spent a decade trying to determine how. He could not determine it. 170 swords, 2 centuries of production. A tradition that appeared in 9th century Scandinavia with knowledge of industrial-era steel production, held that knowledge for 200 years, and then disappeared from the archaeological record without explanation. No final workshop, no record of the knowledge transferring anywhere, no theory that accounts for where the capability went or why it stopped. The swords are in museum drawers across Europe right now, each one tagged with a date, each one containing steel that makes the date impossible. The label says 800 AD. The steel says something humanity would not figure out how to make for another 1,000 years. That gap has not been closed. 170 swords is not an accident, and it is not one man. It is a supply chain. It is ore smelted somewhere by someone who knew how to reach temperatures medieval Europe had no means of reaching, distributed to smiths who knew how to work it, across a network that operated for 2 centuries and then stopped. The infrastructure required to produce and distribute industrial-era steel in 9th century Scandinavia was not small. It was organized, it was sustained, and it left no trace in the archaeological record beyond the blades themselves. Every piece of evidence that should exist is absent. The furnaces, the workshops, the slag heaps, the failed experiments, the tools. Only the finished product survived. 170 finished swords and nothing else. Number 2. The Equatory of the Planetus. In 1951, a Cambridge historian opened a medieval manuscript and found something inside it that he had never seen described in any account of 14th century English science. He built what the manuscript described, and what emerged from those instructions would fundamentally dismantle the accepted timeline of when mechanical astronomical computation first appeared in England. What he uncovered inside that manuscript was a complete set of construction instructions for a brass instrument that computed the position of every known planet simultaneously, without a single calculation from the user, without tables, without arithmetic of any kind. Set the date, read the rings. The planets are there. The instrument was dated to 1392, making it over 600 years old. This meant the Equatory predated the official history of mechanical planetary computation in England by more than a century. It predated the mathematical traditions that were supposed to have enabled it. It predated the scholarly networks that should have produced anyone capable of building it. And most disturbingly of all, the manuscript beside it was detailed enough to have been a teaching document, which meant someone in 14th century England was not just building this device, they were teaching others to build it. For over a century, the accepted story of medieval European astronomy went like this. Medieval astronomy was derivative, absorbing ancient knowledge slowly and imperfectly through Islamic scholarship. Mechanical computation of planetary positions was a late development, requiring accumulated mathematical traditions that took centuries to mature. England was not at the forefront. The instruments that could compute planetary positions mechanically came later, built on foundations that required time to develop. That was the story. The Equatory dismantles that story completely. Derek de Sola Price, one of the most respected historians of scientific instruments of the 20th century, examined the device and concluded the manuscript was almost certainly in Chaucer's own handwriting. He also concluded the instrument showed mathematical sophistication with no documented precedent in 14th century England. Both conclusions cannot comfortably be true at the same time without implying something the official timeline has no explanation for. Price published his analysis in 1955. The field has been arguing about it for 70 years without resolution. The instrument is in Peterhouse College, Cambridge, right now. It computes accurate planetary positions today exactly as it did in 1392. The tradition that built it, the teachers who passed on the knowledge, the workshops where the understanding was developed, none of it is in any surviving record. The instrument sits in Cambridge answering every astronomical question put to it. The question of where it came from has not been answered. Teaching documents do not appear from nowhere. A manuscript detailed enough to allow a 20th century historian to build a working replica was not produced by someone learning as they wrote. It was produced by someone who had already mastered what they were describing, who had taught it before, who had refined the explanation through repeated instruction. Behind the manuscript is a teacher. Behind the teacher is a curriculum. Behind the curriculum is a tradition sophisticated enough to develop, refine, and transmit mechanical astronomical computation at a level England was not officially supposed to achieve for another 100 years. That tradition existed in 14th century England. None of it is in any record that has survived. The debate over whether Chaucer wrote the manuscript has occupied historians for 70 years, partly because the attribution to Chaucer is the only way to place the device within the known intellectual world of 14th century England. If Chaucer did not write it, whoever did write it was working in a tradition with no documented connection to the known learned institutions of the period, no university affiliation that survives, no monastic network that can be identified, no correspondence with known scholars of astronomy or instrument making. A manuscript of this sophistication does not come from nowhere. The person who wrote it had colleagues, teachers, students, a community of practice. That community is invisible in the surviving record. The instrument is there. The community that built the understanding behind it has left no trace. Number 3. Al-Khazini's balance. In 1121 AD, a scientist in the city of Merv set a brass balance on his workbench and wrote down what it told him, describing the method as established workshop practice, something he had inherited, something he had been taught. Modern metrologists who tested those figures 9 centuries later found precision that would force a rewrite of when human beings first learned to measure the physical world accurately, because European science would not match it for another 500 years. What Al-Khazini recorded in his Book of the Balance of Wisdom was specific gravity measurements accurate to within 1 part in 1,000 for most substances tested. That level of precision requires understanding of Archimedes' principle at depth, controlled awareness of how temperature affects fluid density, and systematic error correction refined across repeated trials. Not approximation, not lucky accuracy, systematic precision. His measurements dated to 1121 AD. European science would not reach equivalent precision until the 17th century. This meant Al-Khazini's workshop predated European precision measurement by 500 years. It predated the scientific revolution that was supposed to have made such precision possible. It predated the institutional frameworks that were supposed to have been required to develop it. And most disturbingly of all, Al-Khazini describes the method as inherited, which means the tradition behind his measurements predates him by at least 2 generations, possibly more. He was not at the beginning of this lineage. He names his predecessors. He argues with them by name. He corrects their error margins. He was somewhere in the middle of a tradition whose origins are not recoverable from what survived. For over a century, the accepted story went like this. Precision measurement came from the scientific revolution, 16th and 17th century Europe, where the instruments, the mathematics, and the institutional traditions necessary for that level of accuracy first came together. Medieval measurement was approximate. That was the story. Al-Khazini's workshop shatters that story completely. Donald Hill, who produced the most comprehensive modern analysis of Al-Khazini's work, calculated the precision of those measurements and published his findings in 1979. He did not explain how a 12th century workshop achieved it. He noted that it did. The Book of the Balance of Wisdom is in multiple libraries right now. The workshop tradition that produced it is not in any of them. The Mongols destroyed Baghdad in 1258, and that tradition went with it. How far back it ran, what level of precision it had reached before Al-Khazini recorded it, what other physical properties it had learned to measure with equivalent accuracy, none of that is recoverable from what survived. The measurements are there. The people who developed them across generations are gone. What the Mongol destruction of 1258 erased was not just books. Books were copied and some survived. What it erased was the living practice of a tradition, the workshops where the method was refined, the masters who held the refinements in their hands and in their understanding, the apprentices who were learning those refinements when the city burned. Al-Khazini's measurements survived because he wrote them down. The understanding that produced those measurements, the accumulated practical knowledge of how to achieve that precision, the embodied skill that cannot be fully captured in description, that is what died in 1258. You can read what Al-Khazini measured. You cannot read what his teachers knew that he had not yet learned to describe. Number 4. The Viking Sunstone. In 2013, a marine archaeologist sifting through artifacts recovered from a 1592 Elizabethan shipwreck held up a piece of crystal and recognized what it was. What that crystal confirmed would fundamentally dismantle the accepted account of Viking navigation and force a rewrite of what the Norse understood about the behavior of light 8 centuries before European science formally described the physics involved. What he was holding was Iceland spar, a birefringent crystal that polarizes light. When oriented correctly, it reveals the position of the sun through total cloud cover, through fog, through weeks of unbroken North Atlantic overcast. He held it to the sky above the excavation site. The sun appeared through the clouds exactly as 1,000 years of Norse sagas had said it would. The crystal came from a 1592 wreck. The Norse had been using this technology since the 10th century. This meant Viking navigation predated the formal description of birefringence by 800 years. It predated the scientific framework that would have explained why the crystal works. It predated every account historians had given of how the Norse found their way across the North Atlantic. And most disturbingly of all, the sagas that described the Sunstone in specific operational detail had been dismissed as myth for over a century. The crystal from the Alderney wreck confirmed they were navigation manuals. For over a century, the accepted story went like this. Viking navigation was accumulated empirical knowledge, currents, birds, wave patterns, dead reckoning refined across generations. The voyages to Newfoundland were feats of seamanship and experience, not instrumentation. The sagas were embellishment. That was the story. The Sunstone shatters that story completely. University of Rennes researchers confirmed in 2013 that Iceland spar navigation achieves transatlantic accuracy under simulated overcast conditions. Les Meadows in Newfoundland was not a single lucky crossing. It was a sustained presence, multiple voyages, consistent arrival at the same location across years, and dead reckoning through weeks of unbroken cloud cover does not produce consistent arrival points. The Sunstone does. No Viking-era sunstone has ever been recovered from a Norse archaeological site. The Elizabethan crystal confirmed the technology was real. The Norse originals are gone. The sagas name the tool precisely. The tool works precisely. Every year that passes without a Norse original is another year the official account of how they navigated gets to remain unchallenged. The sagas that describe the Sunstone in specific operational detail also describe other navigation techniques with the same specificity. Current reading methods, wave pattern interpretation, star path navigation refined to a system. The Sunstone was the element that could be physically confirmed because Iceland's spar is a material that survives. The other techniques are described in the same voice, with the same operational precision, in documents that turned out to be navigation manuals rather than myths. None of those other techniques have been systematically tested against the physical record. The Sunstone was dismissed as myth for over a century before a crystal from an Elizabethan wreck made it fact. The question of how many other elements of Norse navigation are being treated as myth for the same reason is a question the field has not seriously asked. Number 5. The Voynich manuscript. In 1912, a book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich pulled a manuscript from a collection in Italy and found that he could not read a single word of it. Voynich, who knew every European script, began an investigation that would remain completely unresolved for more than a century, because what he had found was a document that no literate tradition on Earth has ever been able to account for. What the manuscript contained was an unidentified script illustrating plants no botanist has ever identified, enclosing astronomical diagrams no historian has ever explained, encoding a language that statistical analysis confirms is real, but that no one alive has ever spoken. The letter frequency distributions, word length patterns, and positional constraints on symbol placement are the structural fingerprints of a genuine communicative system. But the system has never been identified. The manuscript dated to between 1404 and 1438 AD, making it over 600 years old. This meant the manuscript predated 4 centuries of cryptographic analysis that would fail to crack it. It predated the Bletchley Park successors who would examine it. It predated the NSA analysts who would examine it. It predated every computational tool that would be aimed at it. And most disturbingly of all, Rudolf II of the Holy Roman Empire paid 600 gold ducats for it. And Rudolf II was one of the most sophisticated collectors in Europe. He did not pay 600 gold ducats for a forgery. For over a century, the explanation went like this. The Voynich manuscript is a hoax or an elaborate cipher, something constructed to look like a language without being one. Statistical structure can be faked. An explanation is waiting to be found. That was the comfortable story. The botanical illustrations shatter that story completely. The plants are not invented. They are drawn with the observational precision of someone who worked with real specimens, root structures, and leaf arrangements consistent with genuine botanical illustration of the period, and they match nothing in any identified flora on Earth. Not European, not Central American, not East Asian, not North African. Specialists in every tradition have compared them. Nothing matches. In 2017, a University of Alberta team concluded the text most likely encoded Hebrew or Arabic. A Keele University team reached different conclusions. They published dueling papers. The field became more contested, not less. Voynich spent the rest of his life on it and died in 1930 without an answer. The manuscript is in the Beinicke Library at Yale right now. It has not been read. What the manuscript implies, if the botanical illustrations depict real plants from an unidentified source, is not just an unknown script or an unknown author. It implies a tradition with access to plant species outside the documented European pharmacopoeia, with a writing system that shares no ancestry with any identified script, and with enough cultural coherence to produce a document sophisticated enough that Rudolf II paid 600 gold ducats for it. That tradition left one document, 400 years of examination has produced nothing to place beside it, nothing to read it against, nothing to use as a key. Whatever produced the Voynich manuscript either ceased to exist before it could leave additional traces, or produced other documents that have not survived. The manuscript is the only evidence that whatever made it ever existed at all. The Rudolf II provenance is the most concrete fact in the manuscript's history, and it raises as many questions as it answers. Rudolf bought it. Before him it belonged to someone else, and the chain of possession goes dark before that. A letter attached to the manuscript claims it was purchased by Rudolf from the Holy Roman Emperor's physician, who had received it from a previous owner, but that chain has never been verified. The 600 gold ducats Rudolf paid represents the kind of sum paid for objects believed to contain significant knowledge. Rudolf was not buying a curiosity. He was buying something he believed contained information worth that price. What he believed the manuscript contained, based on what he had been told or what he had examined himself, has never been established. He did not say. The manuscript does not say. The people who sold it to him are not in the record. Number 6. Villers-de-Hanocourt's calculations. In the 1970s, a structural engineer sat down with a photograph of a 13th century manuscript and began checking the engineering calculations inside it against modern structural standards. He stopped. What those calculations implied would fundamentally dismantle the accepted account of what medieval engineers understood about mechanical force, because the ratios in that 1230 manuscript required understanding of physics that would not be formally described for another 450 years. What he found inside that manuscript was a family of trebuchet designs with counterweight ratios accurate to a degree requiring understanding of rotational mechanics and projectile physics. Not one optimized design produced by trial and error. A family of related designs with proportional relationships across multiple variables. The kind of relationships that only emerge from systematic understanding of underlying mechanics. Someone understood why the ratios worked, not just that they worked. The manuscript was from 1230 AD. Newton was 450 years away. This meant Villard's calculations predated the formal description of the physics behind them by 450 years. They predated every mathematical framework that should have been required to produce them. They predated every institutional tradition supposed to have made such understanding possible. And most disturbingly of all, 3 folios were cut from the manuscript after it was bound, and the annotations surrounding the gap promise elaboration on a self-turning wheel on the following folio. A wheel that turned without being driven. That folio is one of the 3 removed. For over a century, the accepted story went like this. Medieval builders arrived at correct designs through generations of empirical trial and error. The mathematics came later. Practice preceded theory. That was the story. The calculations shatter that story completely. Carl Barnes produced the most detailed modern scholarly analysis of the Villard portfolio in 29 and documented the gap between what the drawings imply was understood and what the official history records as understood in 1230 AD. He did not explain the gap. He documented it. The manuscript is in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France right now. The gap in it has been there for 800 years. The removed pages have not been found. The wheel that turned without being driven has not been explained. 3 pages removed from a medieval manuscript is not a small act of editing. Medieval manuscripts were expensive to produce, time-consuming to copy, and treated as valuable objects. Someone who removed 3 pages from the Villard portfolio made a deliberate decision that the content of those pages should not be accessible to whoever might later read the manuscript. We do not know who made that decision. We do not know whether it was made in Villard's lifetime, in the decades after his death, or centuries later. We know only that whatever was on those pages was considered too significant to leave, and that among the things on those pages was an elaboration on a mechanism that moved without being driven, a self-sustaining motion. In 1230, the physics explaining why no such mechanism can exist would not be formally described for another 4 centuries. Whatever Villard understood about that question, and whatever he had built or observed, is gone. Number 7. The Piri-Reis map. In 1929, a historian unrolling a document in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul stopped when he reached the bottom of the map. What the historian and his colleagues found on that map would fundamentally dismantle the accepted timeline of when Antarctica entered the documented record of human knowledge. What was on the map was the coastline of Antarctica, drawn in specific geographic detail by an Ottoman admiral in 1513, with coastal features that U.S. Navy cartographers in 1960 would conclude corresponded to the subglacial coastline with precision exceeding random chance. The map was dated to 1513. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. This meant the Piri-Reis map predated the official discovery of Antarctica by 307 years. It predated every expedition that was supposed to have first reached that continent. It predated every documented cartographic source that could have provided such information. And most disturbingly of all, the admiral who compiled it named his sources in the margins, described consulting maps he called ancient, and those ancient maps have never been found. For over a century, the explanation went like this. The southern landmass is a distorted South America, or the theoretical Terra Australis that cartographers added to maps without evidence. A lucky approximation dressed as geography. The admiral was working from incomplete and speculative sources. That was the explanation. The precision of the coastal features shatters that explanation completely. Piri-Reis was a practical navigator who named his sources. He had access to the Library of Constantinople, held by the Ottomans since 1453, which contained documents that had not circulated in Western Europe for centuries. Charles Hopgood published a full cartographic analysis in 1966, arguing the source maps came from a civilization capable of accurate cartography at a period the official timeline considers prehistoric. The academic establishment rejected his conclusions. They did not produce a competing explanation that accounts for all the features he documented. Antarctica has been under ice for at least 600 years. If the ancient sources Piri Reis consulted documented a coastline under that ice, those sources predate every known civilization. The map is in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul right now. The ancient sources that fed it have never been found. The implication of those ancient sources, if the coastal features are what the Navy cartographers concluded they were, goes beyond a question of who discovered Antarctica first. Antarctica has been under ice for at least 600 years. A map of its coastline without ice requires a source produced at least 600 years ago. 6,000 years ago, the most sophisticated human societies on Earth were early Neolithic farming communities. Writing had not been invented. Mathematical cartography had not been invented. Navigational systems precise enough to produce an accurate coastal survey of a continent in the southern hemisphere had not been invented. Any source that documented the ice-free Antarctic coastline predates all of that. It predates every civilization in the official timeline of human development. The map is in Istanbul. The chain of transmission that brought a record of an ice-free Antarctica into a 1513 Ottoman chart collection has never been traced to its origin. Number 8. Damascus steel. In 26, Peter Palflaer at Dresden University slid a Damascus blade under an electron microscope and found something inside the medieval steel that stopped him. What Palflaer found in those blades would fundamentally dismantle the accepted timeline of when human beings first produced carbon nanotubes, because modern science had only identified carbon nanotubes in 1991, and Damascus smiths had been producing them for 1,500 years. What was inside those medieval swords were carbon nanotubes embedded in the cementite carbide structures of the steel. Carbon nanotubes have extraordinary tensile strength and thermal properties that modern materials science is still finding applications for in aerospace, medicine, and computing. Medieval swordsmiths were producing them accidentally as a byproduct of a forging process they had refined empirically across 50 generations. The blades dated from the 3rd century AD through the 18th century. Modern science first identified carbon nanotubes in 1991. This meant Damascus smiths were producing carbon nanotubes 1,500 years before modern science knew they existed. They produced them without understanding what they were making. They produced them through a process passed from master to apprentice across 50 generations. And most disturbingly of all, when the tradition broke, the process died with it, and every attempt to recover it has failed. For over a century, the explanation went like this. The properties of Damascus steel came from the specific Wootz ore from India and Sri Lanka, and when that supply was disrupted in the 18th century, the properties were lost. A supply chain failure. Unfortunate but explicable. That was the explanation. Modern metallurgy shatters that explanation completely. John Verhoeven at Iowa State University spent years attempting to replicate the Damascus nanotube structure using historical Wootz ingots and period-appropriate forging documentation. He concluded that 3 conditions had to be met simultaneously: the specific forging rhythm, the temperature cycling pattern, and a trace element combination in the ore he could not fully identify. He could not reproduce all 3 at once. Other researchers have obtained ore from the same geological sources and applied every documented historical technique. None of them have replicated the nanotube distribution or the blade properties. The ore is available. The techniques are documented. The result is not replicable. The nanotubes are visible under electron microscopy in museum blades worldwide right now. The process that created them has never been recovered. What makes the failed replications particularly significant is not just that they failed, it is what the failure pattern reveals. Modern metallurgists have the ore. They have the documented techniques. They have electron microscopy to verify their results at the molecular level. They have understanding of the materials science involved that the original smiths completely lacked. And they cannot reproduce what the original smiths produced routinely across 1,500 years of practice. The smiths did not know what they were making. The modern researchers know exactly what they are trying to make. The modern researchers are failing, and the smiths succeeded for 50 generations. Something that lived in the physical practice of forging, in the specific rhythm and timing and temperature management that was transmitted hand to hand across those 50 generations, has not been recoverable from any written record, any surviving blade, or any combination of modern materials science and historical documentation. Number 9. Al-Jazari's programmable machines. In 1206 AD, an engineer named Al-Jazari presented his patron with a book describing machines he had spent 25 years building before he trusted himself to write about them. What the patron discovered when he examined those machines would fundamentally dismantle the accepted timeline of when human beings first built devices that execute stored instructions, because the logical mechanism inside Al-Jazari's machines is identical to the mechanism inside every programmable device built in the last 200 years. What Al-Jazari had built was a peg cylinder, a rotating drum with repositionable pegs that physically encode instructions the machine reads and executes. Change the pegs, change the output. A musical boat, whose 4 mechanical musicians changed their playing patterns when the pegs were repositioned. A hand-washing automaton that dispensed soap, water, and a towel in a programmed sequence without human intervention. A castle clock, whose figures moved at calculated intervals, each one a device executing stored instructions. The machines were built in 1206 AD. The official history of programmable logic begins in the 19th century. This meant Al-Jazari's peg cylinder predated the Jacquard loom by 600 years. It predated Babbage's analytical engine by 650 years. It predated Lovelace's first computer program by 650 years. It predated the entire documented lineage that leads to modern computing. And most disturbingly of all, the book describing it survived the Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258 in multiple illustrated copies. And those copies are in libraries in Cairo, Istanbul, and Oxford right now. For over a century, the story went like this. Programmable logic began with the Jacquard loom in 1804. That is where the lineage starts. Babbage extended it. Lovelace formalized it. The lineage from Jacquard to every device you own today is documented, celebrated, and taught in every computer science course in the world. That was the story. Al-Jazari shatters that story by 600 years. Donald Hill translated Al-Jazari's book in 1974 and stated explicitly that the programmable drum mechanism is the earliest known implementation of what modern engineering classifies as an automatic control system. He published that in 1974. It has not entered the standard history of computing. The machines have been reconstructed from his instructions at multiple institutions. They work. The 600-year gap between Al-Jazari's peg cylinder and the Jacquard loom is not a gap in the history of human capability. It is a gap in the official record of who gets credit. That gap has not been closed. The standard history of computing traces a clear lineage, Jacquard to Babbage to Lovelace to modern programming. That lineage is real. Those connections are documented. But the lineage begins in 1804, as if nothing relevant existed before. Al-Jazari's book was in libraries that European scholars accessed. The intellectual traffic between Islamic and European scholarship in the centuries between 1206 and 1804 was extensive and documented. Whether the peg cylinder mechanism traveled through that traffic, whether Jacquard's loom drew on a tradition that itself drew on Al-Jazari or his successors, has not been investigated. The connection has not been established. It has also not been ruled out. The official history of the most consequential technology human beings have ever developed has a 600-year gap in it, and the document that might begin to fill that gap is in libraries right now. Number 10. Greek fire. In 673 AD, a Byzantine naval engineer fired a weapon from a bronze pump mounted on a warship pointed at an Arab fleet besieging Constantinople and watched the surface of the sea catch fire. What that weapon did over the next 780 years of continuous operational deployment would force a rewrite of what pre-industrial chemistry was capable of producing, because modern military chemistry has spent decades trying to understand it and has not been able to replicate it. What Greek fire was a substance that ignited on contact with its target, adhered to wet surfaces including wood and human skin, could not be extinguished by water, and burned at temperatures high enough to melt iron ship fittings. No modern incendiary combines all 4 of those properties simultaneously. Napalm achieves some. Thermite achieves some. White phosphorus achieves some. Nothing achieves all 4 at once. Jean de Joinville witnessed it during the Seventh Crusade in 1249 and described it as a thing like a dragon flying through the air with a tail of fire as long as a great lance. He was not writing poetry. He was recording what he saw. The weapon was first deployed in 673 AD. The formula died in 1453. Modern military chemistry cannot replicate it. This meant Greek fire predated by over 1,000 years the incendiary weapons research programs currently trying to reproduce its properties. It predated the chemical frameworks that would be required to explain it. It predated every modern military program attempting to achieve what Byzantine wooden warships achieved routinely. And most disturbingly of all, The document that came closest to cracking the formula in 12 centuries of attempts is sitting in a library in Istanbul, and it has never been fully translated. For over a century, the explanation went like this. Greek fire was a state secret held only within the Byzantine imperial family. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the dynasty ended and the knowledge ended with it. A tragedy of history, sealed and closed. That was the explanation. Al-Kindi's document shatters that explanation. The Arab polymath Al-Kindi wrote a systematic elimination analysis of the Greek fire formula around 850 AD, working through what the weapon definitely was not and narrowing the candidates. That document is in the Süleymaniye Library in Istanbul and has never been fully translated by anyone with both the chemical expertise and the historical knowledge to evaluate what Al-Kindi eliminated and what he left open. John Haldon at Princeton argued in 26 for specific candidate compounds and acknowledged that no modern attempt to combine them has produced all four properties simultaneously. Four modern militaries are spending billions on incendiary and directed energy weapons research right now, trying to achieve properties that Byzantine wooden warships carried into battle routinely for 780 years. Al-Kindi's document is in Istanbul, a short drive from where the weapon was first deployed, and it has been there for over 1,000 years. The translation has not been made. The weapon burned the surface of the sea for 780 years. Every program trying to replicate it has failed. The document that came closest to cracking the formula is still waiting to be read by the right two people at the same time. The four properties of Greek fire that modern incendiaries cannot simultaneously reproduce are not exotic or theoretical. They are properties that would be enormously useful in military applications right now. A water-reactive incendiary that adheres to wet surfaces and cannot be extinguished by water would change the calculus of naval warfare. The research programs trying to develop such a weapon are real, funded and classified. They are working from first principles of modern chemistry. None of them are working from Al-Kindi's systematic elimination of what Greek fire was not. The document that came closest to the answer in 12 centuries of attempts is in Istanbul. The researchers who need that answer are not in Istanbul. The translation that would connect those two facts has not been commissioned. The weapon burned the surface of the sea for 780 years. The sea has been calm for 570 years. The formula that produced it may already be partially described in a document that has been sitting in a library since the 9th century. That document has not been read. The 780 years of operational deployment is not an incidental detail. It means the weapon worked against wooden ships, against iron-fitted ships, against different hull constructions across different centuries, in different sea conditions, deployed by different crews with different levels of training. It was not a weapon that worked once in favorable conditions. It was a weapon that worked reliably enough to be the decisive factor in naval engagements across 8 centuries. That reliability implies a formula stable enough to be transmitted, reproduced, and deployed under operational conditions across that entire span. The formula was not lost to instability. It was held, transmitted, and deployed for 780 years before the political structure that held it collapsed. The collapse of the Byzantine Empire in 1453 did not erase the formula from the physical world. It erased the institution that held it. Whatever Al-Kindi identified in 850 AD as the most likely candidates for the formula's active components is still in his document. That document is still in Istanbul.